Chapter 2. Achua struggled up the rocky escarpment that formed the left wall of the canyon below him, determined to get to the waterfall at the top. He was climbing what appeared to be a goat trail up the side of the canyon. There was no other possible way to the top. The canyon walls were sheer except for this single spot where the waters fell. The soles of his rawhide footwear slipped on the scree, and his heart pounded from both the effort of the climb and fear he would slip and fall into the depths below. Hair the sheen of a raven's wing grew in thick waves down his back. His dark brown eyes looked down a straight nose with flaring nostrils to a thin-lipped mouth above a determined chin. Achua stood a full 6 feet tall, and his legs and arms, though concealed in buckskins, were strong and muscular. His chest was broad, his face was naturally hairless. Breasting the lip of the ravine, he paused to catch his breath and gaze in awe at the scene before him. Here the mountain was clad mostly in cedars so tall you couldn't see the tops, but he had travelled for many miles through a mixture of oak, elm and maple, which had given way almost exclusively to cedar in the last few miles. Before him now was the waterfall. It flowed out of a hole in the side of the mountain, 3 paces across and 2 wide. The water fell steadily from above in a thin curtain that splashed into a pool at its base, that then spilled over the lip and ran down the mountainside to become part of the lake and the river that over many eons had been carved into the landscape by the flow. Beside the waterfall was a deep cleft in the mountainside, forming a path into the forest behind, but directly to the left was a wide clearing, 200 paces long and more wide. The mountain ran up the northern side of the clearing and curved back along the eastern edge and met the forest that formed its southern boundary. Achua pulled himself over the lip of the ravine and stood on the verge of the meadow. In the edge of the forest immediately beside him was a laden peach tree, and Achua reached for one, biting into its juicy sweetness and savouring the flavour. He licked the sticky juice off his fingers and surveyed the clearing once more. What? Achua narrowed his eyes and squinted towards the cleft in the mountain. That's a stone path. He had never seen such a production. His own people laid nothing on the bare earth of their trails and paths. His eyes followed the cobblestone to their conclusion, and then widened as he spotted the door where it ended. A faint wisp of smoke rose from somewhere above the door. He peered into the shadows of the overhang on the side of the mountain and began to discern the structure beneath it. He had never seen such a building. Achua crouched at the edge of the forest, hidden in the shadows, and considered his next move. The door of the cabin opened, and 2 figures emerged from the shadows. Achua stared. They were like no one he had ever seen. The taller was long-limbed, with copper hair that hung in glistening waves down its body. Its limbs appeared to be wrapped in a shimmering fabric of similar colour. The shorter had waist-length white hair interspersed with every colour of the rainbow, and it likewise appeared to be clad in a similarly toned fabric that encased its limbs. They were both long-limbed, taller than any he had met before, and slender as saplings. They passed down the path towards the waterfall, and as they drew even with Achua on the other side of the clearing, he realized the garments they were wearing were actually their body hair, and they were, in fact, without any actual clothing. The pair dove in unison into the pool at the base of the waterfall, resurfacing a few minutes later with large shellfish in their hands, which they carried with them as they entered an opening behind the waterfall. A cave? Achua wondered. They then disappeared up the trail into the forest. Achua crept out of his hiding place and sprinted across the intervening space, slipped onto the trail behind them. He paused, listening to the murmur of their voices as they travelled up the path. They spoke in an unknown tongue. He waited till they were well out of sight before following, his heart pounding in his ears. The lightening of the path informed Achue that he was coming to another clearing, so he stepped into the forest at the side of the path and crept to the edge of it. Several long-horned goats grazed on the herbs of the meadows. Multiple kids jumped and played on a large fallen tree trunk that had split the meadow diagonally when it had fallen many years before. In the shade of the tree on the far side, more of the herd lay sleeping. Several blue and white furred rabbits hopped among the herd, and rainbow-feathered birds flitted from tree to tree. A pair of grey squirrels chittered in the branches. The air hummed with the drone of insects, and Achue swatted a gnat that decided to taste him. The animals in the clearing jerked their heads in his direction, sprang to their feet, and vanished into the surrounding forest. "Gah!" Achue uttered, annoyed with himself for his stupidity. He rose swiftly to his feet and retraced his steps to the waterfall, then continued up the path along the side of the mountain. He stood for some time just staring at the outer wall of the dwelling. Except for the fact that the stones were set evenly one upon the other to form a solid wall, Achue would have said it was a cave. The door was a solid slab of redwood bark, attached to a willow rod frame and hinged with plaited twine rope. A simple wooden slide hatch held it closed. Achue, looking back towards the trail in the forest, quickly drew the latch and slipped into the dwelling. He closed the door behind him and surveyed the room. It was not what he expected. Though the front wall of the dwelling was man-made, the rest of the walls were formed of the rock of the mountain. The room was only 4 paces wide and perhaps 6 long. The only wood in the structure framed the window and the door. A pile of animal furs lay in the back corner. The walls, ceiling, and floor were solid sandstone and should have been cold, but the interior was warmed by the strangest-looking fireplace Achue had ever seen. This structure had what appeared to be a clay platform attached on one side of a taller platform on which was a rounded clay-covered dome with a bark slab door in the front. Off the side of the higher section, another knee-high adobe bench extended a couple of feet, ending in a small firebox. Only a few embers glowed in the grate, but the entire structure radiated warmth. The window was a simple rough opening. The remains of a meal lay on the platform: the butt of a loaf of bread, half a round, pale, cream-coloured something, with a large wedge cut out of it, and a selection of ripe fruit. There were pawpaw, persimmon, apples, and pears. Achue stole the loaf and cream-coloured object, and looked out of the window for signs of the returning occupants. He saw no one, so slipping out of the house, he disappeared into the shadow of the trees. Achue found himself a concealed spot under a fallen forest giant and consumed his ill-gotten gains. The pale-coloured, creamy item had a soft texture and slightly acidic flavour. His people did not know this food, but he liked it very much. He was just finishing off the last crumbs of bread when from above him appeared 2 heads, one with copper and one with white and rainbow-coloured hair. 2 pairs of brilliant blue eyes looked at him inquiringly, and with some disapproval. Achue scuttled further under the fallen tree and drew his knife, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been a simple matter for them to track the intruder to his hiding spot. They moved through the forest silently, their passage calm and unhurried, until they arrived at the tree and climbed down the log to peer into the boy's retreat. Their movements were so swift and unexpected that Achue was outside, dangling from 2 pairs of surprisingly strong hands, before he realized they had sprung to the ground in unison, reached into the den, grasped him by his shoulders, and lifted him out. His knife fell from his hand and landed with a dull thunk on the ground, and he whimpered in terror. Achue tried to struggle free, but after several seconds of no success, hung limp and defeated, at which point he found himself being set on his feet, although the grip on his shoulder did not lessen. The male, for it was obvious now which was which, uttered a phrase in a musical language which Achue found incredibly haunting, and indicated he precede them out of the forest. He complied, his mind racing with questions. From this new perspective, Achue was forced to revise his previous observations regarding their fur. Their body hair was not like fur at all. It was more like thistledown, and it rustled. They were so slim they appeared fragile, yet were incredibly strong. But what were they? Gods? Spirits? They were solid beings, but Achue was perplexed. He didn't delude himself that he could either outrun the pair or overpower them. He had not felt small since he was a very young boy, but these two towered over him by at least a foot. They talked together over his head as they walked, their tones calm and musical. Achue's people were plainsmen, farmers and hunters, who all looked somewhat alike, with solid bodies and almost hairless limbs. Everyone he had ever met in his life had been similar. These two? Achue had no idea, but he was beginning to think he wasn't in as much trouble as he should be. The pair laughed together, though it was not apparent what had amused them. Achue dared to glance up at them, and they actually smiled at him. He blinked and offered a weak grimace in reply. Back at the dwelling he was gently but firmly compelled to sit on the heated bench. It was a little warmer than he liked, but did not burn him. The male laid one palm on his own chest and uttered a high, three-note call. "Trill!" he seemed to sing. "Trill," Achue repeated, his voice sounding harsh and guttural after the sweetness of trills. The female mimicked the action and sang, "Ilin." That was far easier for Achue to repeat. "Ilin," he repeated. They watched him in expectant silence. He in turn laid his hand on his chest and said, "Achue." They smiled at him, their pearly white teeth glistening. "Mchea," they uttered in unison. Achue frowned slightly. "Huh?" The pair looked at him and one another and shrugged slightly. Achue frowned. Ilin pointed to the bench Achue was seated on, then moved a hand in the direction of the oven. "Stabat," she sang, with a little click of her tongue. "Stabat," Achue obediently repeated. "Mchea," Ilin uttered and clapped her hands. Achue tilted his head. "Mchea, good? Mchea, good." "Good," repeated Ilin. "Mchea, good." "Mchea, good," sang Trill. Apparently, having established a basis for communication, Trill and Ilin were content to let it stand and moved towards the doorway. Achue rose to his feet cautiously. They made no move to prevent him. He followed them out of the stone cottage. The three walked down the cobblestones to the cave where the pair entered. Achue followed. The pair spoke no words. It was almost as though they read one another's thoughts. Achue was intrigued. Trill began to rearrange the pile of harvested herbs on the raw branch framework at the back of the cave where they were drying, while Ilin took a small wooden implement off the shelf. It was an oddly carved piece of wood. A thin shaft extended from an equally thin wheel-like section, beneath which was a round-shaped head with a curved bone hook in the exact centre. "Sasharda," she said to Achue. "Sasharda," he repeated, and she nodded. She seated herself on a stone bench and drew a bucket of white raw fleece towards her. "Sharda," she said in her sing-song accent. Achue obediently repeated the word. The fleece was laid in the bucket in segments, about a hand in length and half as wide, with a row of holes on one end. Taking a piece, Ilin rolled the end of it into a thin strand that she looped through the hook of the implement, doubled it over on itself, and spun the shaft between her fingers. As she did so, she pulled thin strands of the fibres from the segment. The spinning of the sharda caused fibres to form a strong strand of woolen yarn that she wrapped around the shaft when it became too long to deal with. Taking the end of the strand, she hooked it again and continued spinning, constantly taking more segments out of the bucket and adding them into the strand as it became thread. Achue had seen his foster mother do this with plant fibres, but without the wooden tool. This looked a lot more efficient. The bucket emptied rapidly, and Ilin was done around the same time Trill finished with the herbs. It had begun to grow dim in the cave as the day wore to a close, and Trill picked up the molluscs they had collected earlier and indicated they were departing. "Jumbaya," he said, tapping the shells. Achue was familiar with shellfish, though he had never seen one the size of those Trill carried. "I'd have called it a clam," he thought to himself. "It wasn't for the size." "Clam?" he offered. Trill cocked his head to one side. "Klamba," he sang, tapping a long forefinger on the shell, then waved towards the cottage and repeated, "Jumbaya." Thought Achue, "I got that one wrong. Interesting that the words should be so similar." As it turned out, Jumbaya seemed to mean "let's eat," because upon returning to the cabin the two fell to building up the fire and cooking the clams. Ilin opened the little door in the front of the clay oven and placed the clams inside, closing the door firmly. She then moved behind the stove and from the shadowy recesses brought forth purple palm-length tubers, which she added to the clams as they opened in the heat, like a yawning mouth, and Ilin sat 2 of the tubers inside each one, forcing the top closed over them. The pair left the cottage for a few minutes, and Ilin returned with a clay pitcher of milk and a wheel of cheese. Trill had picked up the empty fruit bowl as he left, and he now sat it, refilled on the table. The aroma of cooking filled the interior and wafted out of the windows into the darkening afternoon. Achue's stomach growled loudly. He looked at the ball of cheese and pointed, asking, "What is that?" Trill balanced the wheel in the palm of his hand and replied, "Cheese." Achue grinned. "Cheese mchaya. Cheese good." To distract himself from the smell of cooking, he pointed to several items in the room, beginning with the bed. "Bed?" he asked. "Sone," responded Trill. "Table?" "Tonan." "Stool?" "Tonan tea." Achue pointed to the bowl of fruit. "Chipo," Trill responded, picking up the bowl in one hand. He removed a pair of cherries still dangling on their stalks and sang, "Gradia." Achue picked up a cherry and repeated, "Gradia," as he bit in half, ostensibly to expose the seed, but in fact because he was very hungry. "Seed?" he said, but his lips twitched, and he ate the rest of the cherry. "Spama," responded Trill with an answering smile. "Well, I guess you don't plan on killing me if you're teaching me your language," he uttered aloud. Truth be told, he wasn't very concerned for his safety. Despite his theft of their food, they appeared to have no animosity towards him, instead treating him like a welcome guest and making every effort to establish communications with him. To one another they spoke little. A look seemed to be all they needed to communicate. Ilin reached above the stove to a shelf Achue had not noticed and lifted down a small stone jar with a flat lid. She opened the door of the oven and, lifting the top off each clam in turn with a long, thin pair of wooden tongs, sprinkled them with the contents of the jar. "Salt," she said. They ate with their fingers, pulling the flesh of the clams and the tubers apart. The only implement used was a knife with which Trill cut chunks of cheese. The meal was delicious, and they consumed it as the last rays of daylight faded, only to be replaced by a rising, almost full moon. Ilin went to the back of the cottage and returned with an enormous fur that she laid on the bench formed by the stove. Uttering the word "Sonne," she indicated that Achue slept there. Then the couple moved back to the back of the cabin and apparently fell deeply asleep. Achue, lying in the gloom, listening to the sound of the night that filtered in the window as his mind processed the events of the day, was lulled to sleep by chirping crickets. He was awakened by the full moon streaming through the crystal skylight directly onto his face. Sitting up, he flung off the fur that covered him and swung his feet to the floor. The bench beneath him and the stone floor still radiated warmth as he padded to the door barefoot, intending to relieve himself, so the chill of the night air came to as quite a shock, as did the dusting of frost that lay over everything. He hastily donned his footwear and stepped out the door, passing into the edge of the forest. As he was relieving himself, he became aware of an odd, constant sound coming from somewhere close in the forest. It was like thousands of dry leaves being tossed about, but not violently as a rooting pig might, sort of soft and playful. He crept in the direction of the sound till he perceived what looked like a circle of transparent figures dancing around an enormous tree with rainbow-coloured slashes in its glistening white bark. Awed, Achue stared in silence for what seemed like hours, till the dancing stopped, and Achue could scarcely believe his eyes. Trill and Elin emerged from the tree. They simply appeared to form within the trunk and step out into the forest. The rest of the figures then melted into the surrounding saplings. Achue's eyes grew round in awe, and his mind formed the words, "Tree spirits." Trill and Elin walked directly to where Achue crouched, reached down and lifted him to his feet, and said in unison, "Sonne!" He blinked and gaped and walked between them back to the cottage. He could have sworn they were laughing at him. The dawn light filtering through the crystals in the ceiling woke Achue. He sat up and looked around. Trill was nowhere to be seen, but Elin was just entering the cottage, a wooden bowl upturned on a wooden plate in one hand. She smiled at Achue and placed the items on the side of the stove beside the domed clay oven. She then departed again, only to return in a few minutes with an armful of cut sticks with which she built up the fire. "Tan and tea," she sang, tapping the bundle. Achue frowned and pointed to the table. "Tannin?" he asked. Elin shook her head and replied, "Tonnen," pointing to the sticks, and replied, "Tannin." He nodded in understanding, and now watching her as she set to work, wondered if he should offer to do it for her. He had never seen a fire built in this manner. His people cooked in and over open coals in a circle of stones. This small fire was built inside the mouth of a clay box, no more than 2 feet long, that connected to a taller platform on which sat a domed oven, in which Elin had cooked the clams the previous day. The heat produced inside the oven from the tiny, in Achue's eyes, fire, and the way the clay box held heat, was magical to him. Achue stepped out the doorway and into the forest for a necessary minute, returning as Elin slid a risen loaf of dough off the wooden plate and onto the stone floor of the oven. Achue's people cooked their loaves in the coals, and the outer crust was always blackened. From his stolen meal the previous day, he knew that this would not be the case with this loaf. He sat on a stool and took a peach from the fruit bowl and ate it, licking his fingers and wrists clean of the sticky juice that had dripped as he bit into the succulent flesh. He sat, unsure what to do with the seed, and then tossed it out the window. When the loaf was cooked, they left the cavern and traversed the distance between the cottage and the cave, then turned between the cleft and headed up to the high meadow, where Trill waited with a herd of long-haired goats. "Marha!" Elin uttered the word while waving her hand towards the mountain goats. "Goats," Achue responded, adding, "Marha." Elin smiled. Trill indicated to Achue that he follow him along the side trail that led around the side of the mountain beyond the waterfall. The trail was directly along the base of the rock face of the mountain. As Achue followed Trill, a strong smell of manure was wafted to his nostrils on the morning breeze. When the trail terminated, a wide shelf jutted out from the base of the mountain and formed a gently climbing path up the otherwise sheer mountainside. The smell of manure was stronger here, and Achue was surprised to see a living willow hedge forming a sheltering barricade between the outer edge of the ledge and the mountain. "Marha Sonne," Trill informed him. "Goats sleep here." "You made that for the goats?" He was intrigued. The trunks of the willow saplings were woven around and through each other like a lattice, forming an almost solid living barrier against the weather. Achue stopped and gasped. "How?" he spluttered. "What did you say?" He had fallen back a pace upon the realization that Trill had spoken his language. tripped on a tussock and was now sprawled on the ground in an undignified manner at Trill's feet. You speak my language!" Archway gasped. Trill smiled kindly and reached a hand to assist him to his feet, before replying, "All languages come from the first, all that sprang after from those. I speak the first. To understand I listened." "We are dryad," he continued. "You call us tree spirits, for we are the guardians of the forest. This," he waved his hand expansively, indicating the entire mountain hideaway, "was prepared for you. Yah has chosen you to learn his way and to teach it to your people." Archway couldn't believe his ears. They had been expecting him? Me? How is that possible? Why me? He nodded bitterly. "I am nothing, no one, tribeless. There has to be a mistake." He was crushed. "I know not why you," Trill replied. "Yah commanded. We live only to obey Yah's will." "My people will not listen to me," objected Archway. "My guardian is a squirrel." He trailed off dejectedly. Trill's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Yah commands," he intoned solemnly. "Take courage, for Yah will make you a tribe and a people of renown among the tribes." Now Archway knew there had to be a mistake. "Our people are few," he spluttered. "I'm no warrior. We do not make war, for Yah commands kill only what you can eat. We grow crops, as Yah commands work with your hands and eat the fruit of your labour. One is, people take what we cannot conceal, and a good portion of our people do not survive the long winter months. We do not fight." His tone was bitter. "We just die or become slaves." "Yah commands not to take a life without just cause," Trill replied. "If a man lies in wait to take another's life, his life is forfeit. The one being threatened is justified in defending himself, even to the taking of the life of his attacker. A life for a life. So you want me to tell my people we have not understood Yah?" Trill did not answer. Instead, he lifted his eyes and looked towards the waterfall. "We have a guest," he said in his sing-song voice, smiling.